Hey everybody, Sam Garcia, architect from McAllen here, coming back at you with How to Buy Architecture Part 3. This video is going to be discussing the process of design, and I'll get into that a little bit more in depth. Just to recap, the first two videos in this series, How to Buy Architecture. In the first video, I did an overview of how architecture fits into the larger construction and real estate industry and what the different major players were in the overall process. In the second video, I dove a little bit deeper into the actual technical and legal meaning of what the instruments of service and the plans that an architect delivers are. Today, I'm going to get into what the actual design process is and try to describe that a little bit more technically and talk about what that actually is and how that relates to a given project. Now, the design process and design in general is a subjective thing. It's not an objective hard science. It varies from person to person, from architect to architect. And so what I'm going to be talking about is sort of a generalized overview of a project, and how a given project, say for new construction, for example, typically goes through a series of phases, which, truthfully speaking, each phase kind of blends into the next phase, and there's not necessarily a hard line distinction between an early phase and a late phase. It's really kind of a project is sort of a continuum from start to finish. It evolves over time, but in general, it can be divided into the design process itself can be divided into four main phases. The first phase of a project is the conceptual design. And the conceptual design starts at a very generalized level. When a client comes in, the purpose of the conceptual design is to really set forth the parameters of a project, establish the overall vision, the goals, and to begin exploring initial ideas. Oftentimes a client, by the time they come into an architecture office, they have been thinking and dreaming about their project for a long time. So a client is often going to come in and have, if not crystal clear ideas, at least some very strong opinions and some definite ideas of what they want their project to be. And that's a good thing. We want a client who kind of knows what they're looking for. This phase, though, also involves sort of brainstorming, discovery, an interplay between the architect and the client, really a lot of dialogue, walking through a project. What are your goals? What are your needs? And at this point, I always explain to a client that there's really a triangle of needs. There's the design needs, the timeline needs, and the budgetary needs. And there's the saying of, do you want, if it comes to, do you want a great design, a super fast timeline, or a really good price? You can have whatever you want, but the catch is that you can only have two of them. That's not exactly true, but there is always a give and take between competing demands of a project. If you want something super fast, but super, very elaborate design, it's not going to be cheap. If you want something very inexpensive and very fast, the design is going to be very simple and it's going to be very straightforward, and there's not going to be a lot of time for experimentation and going around and around and around. And if you want something that's highly designed out, very deeply thought through, and super high quality, super, time is no issue, then it's not necessarily going to be cheap. So that's something that an owner should always keep in mind. The next phase after conceptual design, after the initial goals and parameters of a project are established, you go from conceptual design to schematic design. Schematic design is where the ideas begin to take shape, where we begin to actually put ideas down on paper. We begin to do initial floor plans, massing studies, which is the masses of a building, what it looks like, if it's 1 story, 2 story, if it's tall, skinny, whatever the case might be. Does it have a lot of windows? Does it have a lot of doors? Does it, what does it look like? What sort of style is it? Et cetera, et cetera. And then we really hone in on the arrangement of spaces, especially as it relates to a floor plan. What sort of order of spaces, what is next to what are the key adjacencies, all those things. So we begin to put the project on its feet. It goes back to the client, they give feedback. We refine the concepts even further. We continue to do a schematic design. Once the schematic design gets to a certain level of refinement and certain level of acceptability, it goes into what is called the design development phase. So ideally, you go through schematic design, you're testing several designs, you hone in on one, you pick one design that you're going to go with, and then that design goes through design development. It's an expansion of the schematic design. Things begin to get a little bit more crystallized. You begin to bring in other technical elements of a project, what the structure is going to look like, what are the materials going to look like, are there going to be any specific architectural features, and then we bring in our consultants that we talked about previously. We start looking at what the electrical systems are going to be, what the air conditioning systems are going to be, how the plumbing is going to work, things of that nature. So we begin to incorporate actual technical, the guts of a building, as we like to say, and we begin to incorporate that into the design. That will almost always necessarily cause adjustments, and it modifies the schematic design as you begin to fit in the real world aspects of things as mundane as ductwork for air conditioning system, plumbing lines, things of that nature. Then we continue to massage that even further. You go back and forth with the client and you get more specifics. Once the design development process gets to a certain level and you have a really good idea of what the building is going to look like. Ideally, you have everything from the site, from the parking, from the access, the driveways, all the way to as far as where's the trash going to go, where the dumpster is going to go. Something that we don't think of, that you might not think of very often, but it actually is a very important aspect to a building. It's one of those things that's not glamorous and not sexy, but if you've ever had the experience of the dumpsters 200 yards away from where your office is or where your building is, it's a pain in the butt, and it becomes a real nuisance, and it can really hinder the ultimate success of a building. Something as simple as the dumpster is way too far away, or it's way too close, and the back of the building, it always smells like trash back there. Not something that, as when we talk about architecture and design, that you want to really focus on, but there's dozens of little details like that if you don't get it right, and if you don't think it through and it's not designed correctly and not well thought out, it can really hinder the success of a building. One of the things that is a personal pet peeve of mine, and my employees sometimes laugh at me because I'm really kind of anal about this, but something that I'm super big on are when it comes to public restrooms. I always like to put if possible, I always like to tuck them behind a corridor, behind a wall, around a corner. The thing that completely gets under my skin is when you're in a public building, if you're like in a lobby or something, and a bathroom door opens directly out into the lobby. I think it's a lack of privacy. I think it's gross. I think it just kills a project. So, that's something that for some reason I'm just really meticulous about that, and it's just one of those things that I'm always paying attention to, because I think it can really disrupt the user experience when the bathrooms aren't right. So the design development phase sort of irons out all those kinks. Once the design development phase is done, we get into really doing the construction documents, which is ultimately what I talked about before, which are the true instruments of service, which really brings together everything. And the construction documents are the final plans of a project, and they have to work at various levels. It's almost like a book that you can read at multiple levels. On the one hand, you can sort of read the basic story, and then there's the subtext, which is I don't know. I'm not gonna. I don't have a book that comes to mind, but sometimes a book could be, it's about cops and robbers, but really underneath it, it's actually talking about the political situation in the country, and underneath that, it's really talking about humanity in general. I'm not saying that all architecture is a discussion on humanity in general, but what I'm saying is it has to operate at different levels. And the different levels are, number one, it has to be an instruction manual for the actual laborers and workers who are going to be installing the doors, the toilets, that are going to be putting up the drywall, that are going to be putting in the electrical outlets. It has to tell them exactly what to do. It also has to tell the general contractor what material is going into the project so that they can price it appropriately. It also has to work at the level of compliance with city and city officials, code officials, and so forth. So there has to be information in there that is geared towards the city, if you will, towards the general contractor, towards the subcontractors, and then it also has to be something that the owner can understand and understand what they're getting. So it's a set of documents that really is operating at several levels of meaning, and it all has to work interrelated. Those are the construction documents. So this whole thing, going from conceptual design through schematic design, through design development, into construction documents, is an integral part of delivering a project that meets the client's expectations, that tries to remain on budget as best as possible, and addresses the natural constraints that any project is going to have. The client has a huge role to play in this process because they are constantly going to be providing feedback throughout each phase. The best clients come in with clear ideas and a clear vision, and they can make clear decisions. And they don't, it inevitably may happen where we're pretty far into a process and then there's a revision or situation changes, context changes, and we need to make revisions. You try not to backtrack too much. Ideally, the ship is sailing in one direction. You don't want it zigzagging all over the place and being, to where you're doubling back and you're starting over, and then, let's change this out completely, and then no, let's go back to the original idea. When you start doing that, it can become pretty chaotic and can lead to kind of a more difficult project. So ideally, you want to kind of keep it moving in one direction. And so, that's sort of the design process in a nutshell. Every architect is going to approach it slightly differently and have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the design process. But generally, the overall arc of it is you start general, and over time you're working towards more and more specifics. And a good architect will help to guide the owner and guide the client towards those specifics. The expertise in design, I believe, comes from being experienced and then sort of steering your client away from possible pitfalls and possible mistakes. It doesn't always happen that at least for me, that I can clearly articulate where those mistakes might happen, or where those problem spots might be. And so there's a level of trust that the client has to have towards the architect. If that rapport and that trust is there, and there's a reason that the architect is saying to do something a certain way or suggesting that we should do something a certain way, a savvy owner will say, okay, I trust what you're saying, and that's why I hired you, and we're going to go in that direction. It has happened in the past where, for various reasons, there's a specific direction that a owner or client wants to go in, somewhat against the architect's suggestions and against the architect's better judgment, and almost 19 times out of 20 it comes back to say, you come to find out at the end, we probably shouldn't have done that, and now we're gonna have to go back and kind of do it the way the architect would have recommended from the beginning. So not that we're omnipotent and don't make mistakes, but I think it is important that a good relationship of trust and of clear communication exists between the architect and his client. So I would just encourage anybody who's interested in this, to think about the value of good design. And if you ever find yourself on a journey with your architect, understand that it's going to be a process, that it starts general, gets towards specifics, and that there's different stages of the project, and so you can expect it to go through those various stages. So I hope to have more on this topic, but that's it for today. Thanks.